Welcome to a day-old curry served on a plastic spatula. And in today's video, I'm going to show you how I speed painted Blade. This model comes from Prey Collection Studio. I will put a link for them in the description below. And in this video, I'm going to do a speed painting of this particular statue. When I first saw this statue, I thought to myself, this would be an awesome candidate for something a little bit more graphic and a little bit more object source lit. And here we are. I've painted Blade with the brightest glowing of orange you'll ever see in your life. And I'm going to show you how I did that. So, it's going to sound like a broken record at this point, but I do have a video on dusting your models before you start painting them if you look in the top corner right now. Obviously, I've already primed this model and I used Vallejo black primer for this. Part of my inspiration is more from the comic style of Blade. I'm going to try and get a slightly warmer skin tone and I'm going to try to make it look a little bit more comic and a little bit more graphic. Since he's mostly black as a character and his suit doesn't have as many details in it as you would imagine, I'm going to have to be a bit creative in how I bring out the highlights on this model. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to add a slight cool grey to the highlights. This is going to come from a 45-degree angle from his left hand side if you're facing the model. Technically from his right, but let's not get too hung up on left and right. I'm now going to base coat all the main parts that I needed to base coat. For the skin, I used the same Vallejo Fairy Flesh set that I used for all my skin tones, and I started off with burnt flesh. I'm then going to take a slightly darker silver and I'm going to paint the stakes that he has strapped across his thighs. I'm painting them silver because in my mind I'd imagine they'd be more effective silver than they would be if they were just wood. But, you know, wood still works. I'm going to do a couple of coats of the base coats on the skin because this is the best way of getting the most even coat, obviously. Going back to the skin again, I'm going to highlight that with a little bit of reddish flesh and I'm going to use base flesh at the highest points. Working on the base, I'm going to do a dry brush. I painted it with a grey and given it many coats of different dry brushes. I'm choosing to keep it quite desaturated because I'm going to create a glow on this base later. There's a symbol on the base that I'm going to paint with white first. I'd rather choose to paint this with a solid paint rather than a wash because I have a little bit more control over getting it in the cracks and making sure it's nice and tidy. Going back to the head sculpt, I'm going to start painting his hair, and this is pretty simple. It's just a solid black with a slightly greyish, bluish highlight to the one side. And as you can see, as it's a speed paint, I'm going between many different parts at the same time. I'm now going to start putting the model together because I've already gotten it quite far past the point where I'm happy with the base tones and the sort of starting point of this entire paint scheme. The main focus of this paint scheme is not really going to be how detailed the paint scheme itself is, rather the lighting that will attract your eye to the model instead. We're going to try and create a bit of a clash between warm and cooler colors so that we can create a bit more excitement so that the model itself looks a little bit more rendered like a comic. I'm also going to use pigment powders to make the area around his feet look a little bit more realistic and give it a bit more tone so that it's not just a completely desaturated grey. This is also going to help the colors that go over the top later on as well. Then in order to make sure that the stone he's standing on stands out from the rocks that the stone is placed upon, I'm going to use ROXY Flesh Shade to bring in a little bit more warmth into the stones on the bottom and keep the desaturated version of the stone on top. This is okay because we're going to add saturation to this very soon. So taking this apart, I realized I probably should have recorded this the other way around. But if you just imagine in your head, we're going for something that looks very comic looking. We need bright colors to bounce off parts of the model to try and force your brain into seeing a light that isn't in the room. Going back to the head sculpt again, I'm going to just paint in certain details, small things that I missed, like the glasses, and add in a little bit of detail into the ears, for example, and just add a highlight onto the lenses of the glasses. Why didn't I cut more of the glasses out? Why did I leave so much glasses in?
It's important for people to know how to paint glasses.
I won't lie, getting behind the ears for these glasses was extremely difficult, so I chose to paint it and come back with a thicker brush with a lot of water on the end and rub off the rest of the paint and kind of squish it into the small little gap behind the ear. That was a lot easier than trying to actually paint the piece that went directly behind the ear. This is me putting in the highlights into the glasses. Again, like I said, these details need to be very subtle because we're going to introduce more detail later when we do the next steps that are going to come soon. This is me putting in the shadows into his ears and around his mouth. just making sure that there's a little bit more detail to look at. Generally, I don't like to use a wash to create these kind of details, but for something this small, it's not the worst thing to do, and it can help just bring out certain details with a lot less effort, especially for something like this, which is a speed paint. I'm then going to dry brush a little bit more onto the base. You can see I'm working on many different things as I go along. Unfortunately, when you're working on a speed paint, you seem to miss things as you go, as well as things aren't as tidy as they could normally be, so you'll be going backwards and forwards quite often, trying to catch up with things and tidy things up. If you're trying to paint something fast, it's not a bad thing. It can be really fun to get this done, but obviously you're going to make some mistakes. Now here I'm using Tamiya paint. I'm not sure whether this is an enamel or a lacquer, but I have two of these paints. One is clear red and one is clear orange. And I decided I wanted to try and use them and see what they were like. At first, I sprayed a little bit of the clear red around the main area where I wanted the light to come off. I'm imagining the light is coming from that symbol that's on the base, and it's kind of glowing up underneath his legs. So the light's coming from the bottom, and the other light from the ambient light from his environment is coming from the top. And it's the cross between these two colors which is going to create the saturation for our piece. I then came back with the white. This is a white ink from Liquitex, and I prefer to use an ink because it's a lot smoother when it goes down, and it is a little bit easier to run through the airbrush, but I'm going to use that as the base coat for the next steps that go on, and that's going to be the orange first. I'm going to first use the orange, and this is going to be the brightest point of the color. It looks yellow when it comes out, but that's because it's a clear color, so it takes quite a few layers to start building up the actual color. And this is a good thing because this helps you slowly build up to the place you want it to be. I then took a bit of the clear red and I did a couple of other areas around the edges, and this is what I ended up with. And that is exactly how I created this look on this model. It looks like there is an LED, perhaps an orange LED that's shining on him from the one side, perhaps coming from the bottom. That symbol on the bottom of him looks like it's glowing. Sure, it could be a lot better. Sure, if I spent more time on it, it could be a lot more convincing. But as a speed paint goes, this model took me an hour and a half to paint. The entire collection of recordings is only an hour and a half, and I recorded every single thing that I did on this model. So for an hour and a half's worth of work, that's not too bad of an outcome, especially if you don't have much time to paint. You can sit on an evening on a Saturday, perhaps after a long week of work, take out your painting stuff and spend an hour and a half and get a model of this kind of quality. Perhaps it's not going to be as tidy, but it will just be just as good looking, and when it's placed on your shelf with all the other models, you probably won't even notice half the mistakes. At this time, I'd like to say a special thank you to the patrons. We've started building a community over on Discord, and if you join the Patreon, you get access to the Discord. One of our patrons has figured out that something needs to be updated between your Patreon and your Discord in order for you to see all the channels. But if you're having any problems seeing any of the channels, please make sure to let me know in the general chat and we will figure it out with you. As well, at this time I've got 3 new patrons which I'd like to thank for joining the support. First is Paul Burgess, then Ashley Thundercliff, and Diggers. I told you the names were going to get worse. Unfortunately, I don't read names very well. But if you've already joined the Patreon, thank you guys so much for the support. It's because of your help that I'm able to keep these lights on and keep painting these models for you guys. As usual, if you liked the video, give it a like. If you didn't like it, give it a dislike and just fuck off. Because I spend an hour and a half of my time painting a model for you, and if you don't like it, I don't have anything left for you anymore.